Welcome to Bringing Romans to Life. I'm Preston Burrows, and in this lesson, we'll consider the people to whom Paul wrote Romans as he portrays them in Romans chapter 16. We aren't told a lot about to whom Paul writes this letter in the first chapter. Instead, we find expanded personal greetings at the end of the letter. So in this lesson, we're going to consider the types of people to whom Paul wrote this letter. And my reasons for considering chapter 16 before we dig into chapter 1 is twofold. Most significantly, it should help us understand a bit more about why Paul considers the topics he does throughout the letter. And then more practically, it should help you identify more specific profiles for your two characters that you're creating throughout this course. The first thing we should note is that Paul writes to several different groups of people. We might call them house churches. They likely met in different neighborhoods throughout Rome, and they were hosted by different people, and they met in different places from one another. It's unclear precisely how many different congregations in Rome met at this time, and how many Paul identified in his letter. But from what Paul writes in chapter 16, there could be about 5 different gatherings or churches. Almost certainly, there is a church that meets at Prisca and Aquila's home, and that we see in chapter 16, verse 5. There's probably another gathering of Christians with the people called Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Petrobus, Hermas, and the brothers and sisters who are with them. Verse 14. There's probably another congregation in relation to Philologus, Julia, Nereus, and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints who are with them. Verse 15. Then there's possibly an additional congregation related to the phrase, those who belong to the family of Aristobulus, verse 10. And then possibly an additional congregation related to those in the Lord who belong to the family of Narcissus, in verse 11. Some scholars suggest that one or more gathering of Jesus followers likely met in tenement apartments, tenement buildings. In other words, low-income apartments. And these may have been located near the Tiber River, where docks for unloading all the cargo supplying Rome came in. And that's where the laborers and very low-income people lived and worked. This area was susceptible to flooding, not only when heavy rains came down and the water would flow from the 7 hills of Rome down to the lowland, but also from the Tiber itself, which would start to overflood because of all of the deforestation happening upstream. So it wasn't a pleasant place to live. And then scholars suggest that there were likely one or more congregations meeting in wealthier neighborhoods, nearer the city center, up on the hills, in more lovely places to live, and places where a wealthy person might have a home and be willing to host a gathering. Chapter 16 provides a variety of names that scholars have organized into different categories, and these categories can help us recognize the diversity of people attending these Christian meetings. So some are of Jewish heritage, some are gentile. There are certainly women present, and some who are prominent enough for Paul to name explicitly. There are slaves or former slaves. And then there are some Jewish followers who likely served some of the most prestigious families in Rome, like Aristobulus, who he was the grandson of Herod the Great, so people associated with Aristobulus, and Narcissus, who perhaps was the freed slave that had served Emperor Claudius. And there are some who had been quite mobile, like Epinetus, and had depended on the hospitality of other Christians. It's important to pay attention to the many women Paul mentions in Romans 16. And these greetings give us a very different picture of Christian leadership than traditional Christian church histories have often provided us. So first, Phoebe. Although Phoebe isn't a recipient of the letter, let's consider her. She's likely the courier of Paul's letter. She's carrying it to them, as it seems in chapter 16. She's the first named deacon in church history. She's called a prostasis, which means a presiding or leading person, or a benefactor, somebody who pays the bills in support of somebody's mission. According to Francis Gensch, Phoebe had the means to travel and was presumably a financially independent woman of some standing who placed her resources, time, and social clout in service of the early Christian mission. And as a courier, according to ancient custom, her responsibilities would have likely included reading or performing the letter, not once, but several times as she circulated among the various house churches of Rome, ensuring that it was properly heard and understood. And so she is really the first interpreter of this letter. And now let's consider the woman named Prissa. Francis Gensch explains about her that she is always mentioned in conjunction with her husband, Aquila. And in 4 of the 6 references to them in the New Testament, her name appears first. And this is strikingly unconventional. And we learned that she was involved with manual labor. She migrated to different cities. She suffered with Paul. She probably founded a house church in Corinth and stayed in Corinth when Paul left. She hosted a church in Rome and was a co-worker with Paul and her husband. And in this way, it doesn't seem as though she's really a subordinate of them. Another prominent woman was Junia. She was probably the wife to Andronicus. She was probably Jewish. She may have been in prison with Paul or had been in prison elsewhere. And, quote, Junia, along with Andronicus, is also singled out in unparalleled fashion as outstanding or prominent among the apostles. And this is most astonishing as a feature of Romans 16, since it's the New Testament's only reference to a woman as an apostle. And this, passage presents her as a prominent or distinguished apostle. Junia's apostleship, however, has struck many as so unlikely that her gender identity had been called into question for many generations, and her name was interpreted as a man's name, even though there's no documentary evidence for that. It seems as though, however, early interpreters, the earliest among them, did recognize her as a woman. But during the Reformation, she experienced an influential name and gender change in Martin Luther's translation. Paul highlights other women and notes that they are hardworking. And here's a list of their names. As Francis Gensch again says, the repeated language of labor that Paul uses in describing each of these women speaks of ministry and mission and conveys hard labor. wearying toil. It is Paul's preferred language when describing his own missionary activity, his apostolic labor on behalf of the gospel, which included preaching, teaching, and evangelizing. He also employs it to describe the labor of leaders within local congregations, labor that entailed expenditure of time and energy to meet needs within the congregation. So these are some of the individuals mentioned in Romans and to whom Paul writes this powerful letter. We have no idea how many other individuals attended these house church gatherings. What's clear from Paul's admonishments in chapters 14 to 15, and then with emphasis again in 15:7, is that Paul wanted the diverse congregations meeting in Rome to welcome one another. No matter how different the individuals were, no matter how different the gathering of Christians were from one another, they were to welcome one another. The likely implication of his repeated admonitions is that they were not welcoming one another. Divisive perspectives or practices, or both, were threatening the unity of the small Christian movement in Rome. What we learn throughout this letter is that Paul was prodding a diverse and perhaps disagreeing Christian population in Rome to overcome its divisions through intentional hospitality and expressions of deep familial ties through the exchange of the holy kiss. So one of the main goals of this letter is to establish unity among diverse and disagreeing Christians. With this information in view, I'd like you to take a few minutes to sketch out your two characters' identities. I encourage you to create one to be a Jewish Jesus follower, the other to be non-Jewish. Keep in mind that Rome was the capital city of an empire. The empire enslaved conquered peoples and brought them to Rome for sale and work. So the ethnic identity, while gentile, could be a variety of ethnicities in the Mediterranean and Europe. In other words, the Gentiles in Rome weren't necessarily Roman or Italian. So I would encourage you to please be sure to share your character sketches in reply to the designated community discussion. I really look forward to reading what you come up with.